Today we'll be reading from Matthew 8, verses 5 through 15. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, the centurion came to him, asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering." Jesus said to him, "I will go and heal him." The centurion replied, "Lord, do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the words and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was astonished, and said to those following him, "I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their place at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to his centurion, "Go, it will be done just as you believe it would." And his servant was healed at that very hour. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him.
Good morning, church. It is good to see everyone here this morning. Excited to have some visitors with us. I don't know what's going on to cause so many visitors. Maybe we got some graduates. You know, if I'd have been thinking, I would have done some kind of sermon with a tennis theme. It occurs to me that I couldn't beat any of these kids in tennis. You know, they got other things going on in their life, but these are all exceptional tennis players. Pretty interesting. I want to continue a thought we began a couple of weeks ago where we talked about the idea of choosing between those things that are good, those things that are better, and those things that are best. What we're really talking about is ideals or priorities. And very often in our life, those priorities can sometimes get shuffled to the back. We know on one level some things that we ought to be doing, some things that at one level are very important to us. This is what I want to do with my life, and yet as we go through life, there's so many challenges, so many things pulling us in other directions. Sometimes the most important things, well, they get kind of left undone or unattended to. And so I've entitled the lesson this morning, Dealing with Disruptions and Disappointments. And really what I want to do is look at the idea of dealing with disruptions and disappointments in regards to their challenge to those highest ideals that we have, those priorities that we are to have. I also want to kind of take this lesson, and I think it's certainly applicable to our graduates. They're headed off to college. And though you have educational, though you have academic goals, my prayer for you is that your spiritual goals hold the highest priority. If there were ever an environment in which the ideals in which you hold to are going to be challenged, it will be in college. There's a lot of forces pulling you a lot of different directions. And hold on to those things that are most important. We're going to look basically at three ideas, a lot of different ideas in here, and I appreciate the passage being read, but I want to kind of base the lesson out of three different ideas, and one is that Jesus knew His purpose. Luke chapter 19, verse 10, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost." He knew why He was here. He knew what He was here to do. He knew His purpose. And as we read the Gospels, as we read about His life, we see how He lived out His purpose in His life. But as we read in the Gospels of Jesus living out His purpose in His life, we also see that He lived out His purpose in life oftentimes in spite of the people who are around Him. There were plenty of disruptions. There were plenty of disappointments that He had to deal with. And yet, to stay on His task to carry out all that he came here to do. Anybody glad that Jesus fulfilled his purpose? I mean, where would we be? There would be no reason for us to be here this morning if Jesus had not lived out his purpose. And so it should be that we try to do that. Not only did Jesus know his purpose, if you think about it, and I don't remember what the number of prophecies are, but can you imagine living your life and knowing that there's hundreds of prophecies about you? And one of the things you got to get done is not only go to seek and save the lost, but you got to make sure that you fulfill all of these prophecies. Now, certainly his Father has a hand in this, but just in the Gospel of Matthew, I went through and picked a few passages. Think about these things. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. All the prophets were talking about Jesus, as Matthew 5:17. Chapter 8, verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illness and bore our diseases. Matthew 12 and verse 39. But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Certainly he's talking about like Jonah was in the belly of the sea monster for 3 days and 3 nights. So the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Matthew 13:35. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. And then somehow to me this one comes into what I want us to talk about today. Matthew 23:37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Another passage is going to say Jesus came to his own, and his own received him not. Jesus knew his purpose. He lived out his purpose. He came to seek and to save the lost. And he comes to the very people. Here's Jesus thinking, you know what? I've got to fulfill all these prophecies. I've got to fulfill my purpose in life. This is something that I've got to do. I've got to get these things done. And he comes to a people who have a history, of killing prophets, knowing that they will kill him as well. And yet, in the midst of him knowing that they killed the prophets before him, they're going to kill him, he has this heart that says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would have just gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her little chicks. That relationship, that understanding of who he was and what he was to be about, and how that it was all about people and relationships, and yet to fulfill the things he came to do. I appreciate the passage that has been read without the centurion coming to Jesus and showing such great faith. I think it's significant as we think about that story, and we won't reread it. But it's significant to think about that story that here comes a Roman centurion. Here comes a man of authority, but of Roman government authority. And he comes to Jesus and says, hey, I've got someone who lays sick. Could you heal them? And Jesus says something amazing. He says, okay, I'll come with you. And he goes, no. I'm a man with authority. And I know that you are a man with authority. You just say the word, and I know that my servant will be healed. And Jesus is amazed at his faith. He said, I've not found such great faith in all of Israel. It should have been an Israelite that had that kind of faith. But it was a Roman centurion. And in the midst of all this, they come to Peter's house. And they're there to probably get away from the crowds for a little bit and to get some nourishment. And they come in there, and there's Peter's mother-in-law. She's in bed sick. She certainly can't help tend to their needs. And so he goes and he heals her. You just think about it, and I want to challenge you to do this, is just go through the Gospels and read all these stories about Jesus as he's going through his ministry and see how often he's confronted with disappointments and distractions. The first one I thought of was in John chapter 2. It's an odd story for us, one that we sometimes have some difficulty knowing how to handle everything in it. But I want us to notice the disruption or disruption in a sense of this, or at least the unique timing of this. John chapter 2, verse 1, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the wine, the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I want us to notice here the rub between his relationship with his mother and his purpose. If his mother had not intervened, I'm pretty sure that Jesus would not gotten involved in this. This miracle's a little unlike other miracles that Jesus did in a number of ways. Jesus knows that he's to begin his ministry. He's going to do miracles to confirm that he is who he claims to be, to confirm that his words come from God. And this one's a little different. We could kind of look and make some assumptions here. It may have been that his mother was a hostess in these wedding activities, that she had some responsibilities in here. Maybe she was helping in some way. It's interesting. She's invited, Jesus is invited, and his disciples, his followers are invited. And so whenever the wine runs out, she goes over to her son and says, "Hey, they've run out of wine." "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." And that's a huge, his hour coming is a huge idea in the Gospel of John. In this particular instance, I believe the hour means it's not time for me really to begin my ministry. I'm right at the start, but this is not the beginning of this. I don't think he intended this to be his first miracle, and yet something about his relationship with his mother compelled him. I think he looked at this thing and said, "Okay, how can I do this in a way that fulfills my purpose and at the same time helps this relationship?" There are going to be times as we choose between those things that are good and better and best, as we settle in on the idea that I want to have the highest priorities, the greatest ideals, and I need to live out those things. There's going to be times that circumstances come, relationships come into the mix, and we're either going to have to choose our priority or our relationship, or hopefully find a solution where both can be promoted. And I think he does that here, and I think that's ideal. Another story quickly, Matthew chapter 15, verse 21 and following. "And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.' But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she is crying out after us.' And he answered, 'I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.' But she came and knelt before him, saying, 'Lord, help me.' And he answered, 'It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.' She said, 'Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table.' And Jesus answered her, 'O woman, great is your faith. Be it done as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. Notice that Jesus had a purpose in his earthly ministry here. His earthly ministry was to be to the Jews. He was to come to the lost tribe of the house of Israel. He was to come to the Jews and to bring them to faith, to help them understand that their Messiah had come. His mission was not to come to the Gentile nations. Now, we're going to see a number of Gentiles come, but very often it's the Gentiles coming to him. He wasn't going to the Gentiles. They were coming to him. If we look closely at this, he seems to have been tired. He seems to, in this instance, have come to a place where he thought he could get away from the crowds a little bit to rest. You can see this protective thing that the disciples have, that they're trying to hold this Gentile woman at bay. She comes, she's very bold. And Jesus again finds a way to marry his priorities, his purpose, in a relationship here. Luke chapter 22, verse 39. "And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples followed him, and he came to the place. He said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, 'Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation.'" I think about how often Jesus was really disappointed in his disciples. How often he spoke in a parable and they simply didn't get it. How often he performed miracles and they didn't perceive what that really said about him, who he really is. How can you say, "Show us the Father"? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And they're slow to pick up on who he is. They're slow to pick up on the spiritual truths that come from his parables. And here they're slow to pick up on the idea that all of this is about to come to a head. Jesus in the garden, he's about to be arrested. He's about to go through this great passion that we call it. He's about to go through all these things, and he's saying to them, "Look, you need to pray. You need to pray for you." I think he's also hoping they would pray for him, that they would be that presence that was near him to encourage him. How encouraging would it have been for Jesus to come back from his personal prayer to the Father and to see them praying earnestly on his behalf. Perhaps maybe they would be praying to the point that they were sweating drops of blood. That's not what he found. He found them asleep. To their defense, they were tired. They closed their eyes and began to pray, and they fell asleep. Any of you ever fallen asleep praying? Not the worst way we could choose to fall asleep, right? I got a feeling Jesus was disappointed. Those who were closest to him failed to truly understand his purpose. And yet he had to fulfill his purpose despite those around him letting him down. I want you to think about those things. I want you to see this relationship between us living out purpose and the idea that we'll be surrounded by people. And God has set part of our purpose as being these people and growing those relationships. But those relationships are going to be disruptions at times. And those relationships will become disappointments at times. And yet, if we follow the example of our Lord, we'll find that there many times is a way for us to fulfill our purpose in the midst of those setbacks and helping those around us all the more. Last passage. I thought this one is significant. Matthew chapter 4, 24, going into chapter 5, verse 1. So this is the statements right before the Sermon on the Mount. Think about this. Inject yourself into the text and imagine that you're Jesus. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him. You see, Jesus saw these people. He saw these people who represented relationships in his life, and as he considered his purpose, he didn't see them as distractions. He saw them as opportunities to fulfill his purpose. The fact of the matter is, we'll either be influenced by the world or we will influence the world. What is our purpose on this earth? What is our purpose in Christ? What is the purpose to which we've committed ourselves? When we were baptized into Christ, when we died to self and were united with Jesus and raised up to walk that new life, what were we committing ourselves to? Paul will say there in Romans chapter 6, we were raised up to walk a new life. No longer to be slaves of sin, now to be slaves of righteousness, he will say. We've got a new purpose. No longer is my purpose any of my selfish motives. My purpose is to fulfill God's purpose. I'm to grow up in all ways into Him who is the head, even Christ Jesus. I need to look like Him, sound like Him. I need to act like Him. I need to have His priorities. We begin with Luke 19:10. He came to seek and to save that which was lost. We have no greater calling than to introduce people to Jesus, that He may continue to seek and to save that which is lost through us. That's our purpose. It's our priority. Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20, right? We're to go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey all things that He's commanded. And lo, He will be with us always, even to the end of the age. It's our job. It's our purpose in this life. And it's easy to get pulled away from our purpose. It's easy to go from focusing on that which is best down to that which is not as good. Maybe we'd call it better, and then maybe down to good, and maybe even focusing on things that are bad. And I think our twofold challenge is that one is we got to keep seeking those highest ideals, those priorities that God has given us. We need to seek those things that are best. And at the same time, we need to make sure that we take care of those relationships God's put in our life and find out how it is that God would have us to fulfill our priorities, fulfill our purpose within those relationships. Let them not be disruptions. Let them not be distractions. Let not our priorities sever our relationship, or our relationships take us away from our priorities. I hope, graduates, that this makes sense to you. I'm preaching a general sermon, but it applies to going to college. And I'm proud of you guys and prayerful for you guys. But it applies to all of us. We're all challenged every day. And I don't know how this lesson has challenged you. I hope you've set God's priorities as your highest priorities. And I hope that you're not allowing people and distractions and those things to pull you away from those priorities. If we can help you this morning, if we can pray with you, if we can assist you in becoming a New Testament Christian, why don't you come while we stand and sing this song? Had it not been the Lord who was on our side,